Okay, hey everybody. My name's Ashley Myhre. I'm one of the compliance brokers at KW North Shore. I am going to be going over inspection best practices. I do have slides kind of reiterating what the inspection contingency looks like in the offer, what it means in the offer, and then just some kind of best practice items in terms of kind of negotiating for either side, whether you are the seller's agent or the buyer's agent, as well as kind of how you should handle inspections as far as like attending and reading the report and things like that. I would encourage you, if you have any questions, to please speak up. Even if it's in the middle of something, I'd rather you ask the question and we kind of hammer that out and make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, maybe. Sorry. I don't know why it's not doing what I want it to do here. Okay. So the first piece of this is going to be what inspections and testing actually looks like in the offer to purchase. So an inspection is an observation of the property. So that means that they're doing everything kind of from a non-invasive level. A test would be something taking a sample of materials, so like a soil sample, something like checking for mold, taking a sample of something like that, testing the air quality. So, for instance, if you don't have permission to get a radon test completed, then you are not allowed to have a radon test performed in the home because that would be considered a test of the air. The seller agrees to allow the buyers, inspectors, appraisers, testers, everybody reasonable access to the property. So if it's been agreed to in the contract, they had agreed up front to allow those people in. Um, and it says buyer and or licensees may attend all inspections or testing. And in my opinion, as an agent, it is always best practice to try and get to the inspection. It can be very difficult to have the conversation with your client going over the inspection report if you're not present during the inspection. The inspector often offers valuable tips or further information or little tidbits that he's not necessarily going to put into his report. So I like to be present. If I can't be there at the beginning, I at least try to be there at the end because that's where he's able to kind of give a summary of everything. And I do encourage my clients to be there as well if they're able, because he also, in addition to doing an inspection of the home, will also give little tricks or whatever, like, hey, here's where your water main comes in. Remember to turn that off in the winter or things along those lines that are just helpful for a homeowner as they move forward. Um, the buyer agrees to promptly provide copies of all inspection and testing reports to the seller. So, a as a buyer's agent, when you get that report, even if you still have time that you're going to be speaking through that with your client, you still need to provide a copy of that to the listing agent in a prompt manner. So, oftentimes you can forward it along and say, I'll be speaking with my buyer about this. Here's a copy for your records. You don't need to say anything more than that. You're just providing them a copy promptly. So we've had people kind of trying to hold them back because they haven't had time to talk with their client. The appropriate thing to do would be to pass it along as soon as you get it, and just let them know you have yet to speak with your client. That way you're doing as the offer suggests and promptly providing a copy. Does anybody have questions on that? Okay. So if you've checked the inspection contingency, it is going to be a Wisconsin registered licensed home inspector. Here is where you want to put in anything specific that they might want um, looked at. A lot of people will try to just put any additional things that the inspector recommends. That's definitely not best practice. If there's something that you all are specifically worried about, let's say the roof or the basement or whatever it might be, you want to put that in here as a like explicitly, instead of saying any additional, tests that the inspector decides on. That way it's clear and concise, and you've gotten explicit permission for that specific thing right off the bat. So a lot of, like the swimming pool is a good example here, things along those lines that don't necessarily go in the initial inspection. If there are follow-up inspections recommended, for instance, the inspector looks at the chimney, he sees some cracking, maybe some issue that he can't see obviously all the way up the chimney. He might say he recommends further evaluation by a chimney professional. Things like that, you're automatically getting the permission up front by on line 200 here, that the buyer may have those follow-up inspections as long as they're done prior to the deadline that you've set forth. Um, the buyer, however, is also agreeing that they will pay for all of the costs of those inspections. So oftentimes, like chimney inspectors, for instance, don't typically do them for free. They usually will have a cost involved. Sometimes it requires that they do a sweep of the chimney so they can actually see what's going on. So just a reminder to mention that to your client, that if there are further things needed, that would be up to them as well, to pay for. The contingency will be deemed satisfied within a specific time frame. So most people are putting between 10 to 14 days, which is why that's in here. Um, if you forget to fill in this line, the automatic is 15. Most people either have a tighter closing deadline or they'd like to know what they're working with sooner than later. So as long as you think that your inspector, your preferred inspectors can get in with the 10 to 14 day time frame, that's usually what we're seeing written into the offer. Again, you want to give the seller a copy as soon as possible. And then if there is going to be any kind of negotiation, you need to make sure that that happens prior to this deadline. If this deadline passes and you haven't either come to an agreement with an amendment that's signed by both parties agreeing to specific fixes, or if you have not served a notice of defects by the midnight on this date, it automatically waives itself and you really have no room to do anything further with it. So it's really important that you're aware of this deadline, the exact date that it falls on, and that you have to have something in writing prior to the end of that date, assuming that something needs to happen. Sometimes there's a pretty good inspection, buyer doesn't want to really do much with anything. You can either let it waive itself. The other agent might ask for you to do an amendment, just waiving the contingency to make, officially, but it will waive itself at this date at midnight. One thing that we kind of like to mention is if you are still in the process of negotiating an amendment and it's kind of coming down to the last hour, you want to make sure that you do have a notice of defect handy and ready and kind of written already so that if you can't come to some sort of an agreement, you've at least sent over a notice of defects to cover your client in that instance that this hasn't at least lapsed. You've sent the notice of defect. The notice of defect could be pulled back at some point later if you are able to come to some sort of an agreement. But that is important to have ready. So I often try to have that kind of done, maybe early evening if it's looking like we're not gonna come to some sort of an agreement by midnight that night. Um, so the other piece to note here is on 210, it says for the purposes of this contingency, defects do not include structural, mechanical, or other conditions, the nature and extent of which the buyer had actual knowledge or written notice before signing this offer. That means anything that's written in the condition report can technically not be used as a defect. So what that means is, and this is completely dependent upon how they explain it in the condition report. So if they explain in the condition report the issue at hand, and then the inspector points it out in the inspection almost verbatim or very similarly to what they said, that cannot be used as a defect. However, if they write it into the condition report and it's much deeper or bigger than they've explained within their condition report, that would have the ability to potentially then be negotiated upon or used as a defect. So just something to keep in mind there. You can, if you're not in competition, you can cross these lines out. So you could cross out lines 210 and 211, which would essentially void this whole portion of it. So even if it was on the condition report, you still have the ability to provide a notice of defects, even if it was on the condition report. So just something to kind of pay attention to there, especially with the market kind of shifting. That was something that I did pretty regularly before we got into this really competitive market we've been in over the last 5.5 years or so. Does anybody have questions on that? Yeah, Leah.
I just have a quick example of what you just stated. It actually happened to me where the seller mentioned, I believe I can't remember exactly, but maybe some cracks or movement in a basement wall,
Hmm.
and they had just bought the house 2 years prior, and so they included their old inspection report, which was 2 years old. But then when we had the foundation examined, it was much worse than what they had explained.
Hmm.
And so, like you were saying, we had that as our defense for what you explained is not what we found. And
Right.
so the repair for that was outside of what my buyer was willing to take on, and the seller wasn't agreeing to help or take care of it themselves. So we were able to use that to exit the deal.
Yeah. And I mean, that's awesome. Honestly, more often than not, they're relatively vague in their condition report anyway. So
Mhm.
this often doesn't come into play, but it can. So it's just something to be aware of. And just know that it's a possibility that that could come up. Um, and if there's some sort of disagreement on whether or not they did explain exactly what the inspection report says, then unfortunately it kind of goes to that attorney territory to kind of figure out who's on the right of end of that, I guess. So, if there are no other questions on this, I'm going to go ahead. So this talks about the right to cure. This only kicks in if a notice of defects is delivered. So how I explain this to people is normally what happens is you're going to have your home inspection. We are going to probably find a few things wrong with the house. It's a used house. We will talk through the items that we think need to be looked at or taken care of, anything that's safety related, is a defect, whatever the case may be. We'll talk through that. We'll figure out how we feel comfortable moving forward. So let's say the electrical panel needs to be evaluated. There's a couple double taps in the panel, and the chimney cap is broken and needs to be replaced. We can write an amendment asking for those items, saying if these items are repaired, the inspection is waived and the contingency is waived and we're moving forward. However, if we can't come to some sort of an agreement, if the seller's not agreeing with what we're asking for, or they'll say, well, we'll do one, but we're not doing the other one. And we're like, well, that's just not acceptable. Whatever the case is, that's when we would go to this portion of serving a notice of defects. So more often than not, we're able to come to some sort of an agreement with an amendment. However, if that's not possible, that's where this notice of defects would be given. So it would be the buyer objects to the following defects, and then all of the defects would be listed in the notice of defects. So people do that two different ways. You can either reference specific lines within the inspection report. So you'd attach the inspection report to the notice and say, let's say line B of the report or whatever. You just kind of label those, or you can write the specific details of the report, like four double taps found in the breaker box, whatever your preference is. You would write that in here. Um, Keeping in mind what a defect is, something that significantly affects the value, safety, um, or the occupants within the home. Um, and basically, you serve a notice of defect. If they have a right to cure, then they have the option within the amount of time you write on line 218. So often I suggest making that a shorter time frame because otherwise you can drag this out and they might decide that they're not going to cure anything anyway. And now you've had to wait 10 days to figure out that they're not doing anything and you haven't been able to move forward that entire time. I usually make it on the shorter end, like 3 to 5, just so you know what you're working with sooner than later. If they have the right to cure, they can say, yes, we will cure the defects. It has to be done in a professional and workmanlike manner, and they have to deliver a report detailing the work done 3 days prior to closing, no later than. If they don't have the right to cure, it just makes it super clear. Basically, you serve a notice of defects and the deal is done. So the right to cure is a lot of sellers obviously would like that. Because it allows them a second opportunity to agree to fix some items. But it's obviously more advantageous to a buyer if the seller does not have it because it's just cut and dry, clear as day, it's done. Um, so if you don't check anything there, it automatically defaults to the seller having the right to cure. So often in competition, people are putting the right to cure in. Um, and we're, you know, just as a way to kind of show like, hey, we're willing to continue to work with you here. But a lot of times, if you're on the buyer side and you're not in competition, not having the right to cure might be your best option. Um, so does anyone have questions on that? Okay. So there is a clause in regarding the right to cure in our zip forms that is super helpful. So if you do offer the right to cure, it just adds some safeguards in terms of how they're curing the defects. So even though the offer says a good and workmanlike manner, that is a very vague concept and it could be taken a lot of different ways. So it could be, their cousin Bill and a case of beer doing the work. Or it could be, you know, I don't know, just someone you maybe don't want doing it or someone who's like, yeah, I could probably get that done. And it could be considered workmanlike, but maybe not to the extent that you're hopeful for. Um, so this just adds in that it would be using a professional licensed expert, that if there was a permit required, that would be pulled, and that it's up to code for the municipality. And it should be defined by a third party expert, the type of work or the scope of work that'll be done. So that's nice in that the seller can't say, well, they just said a couple of shingles needed to be replaced, so that's all we're going to do. Here it's saying this is completely up to the roofing consultant. If they think a little bit more needs to be done than those few shingles, then this is kind of safeguarding you as far as that goes, because it's up to the independent third party expert to decide what needs to be done. Hey, Justin. Okay, so Justin's question was, does the inspection contingency deadline have to be extended to account for potential work that needs to be done? So the deadline for having things done is outlined when you do an amendment. So you just have to have the agreement made by that date, the inspection contingency deadline. You have to have the written agreement of what is to be done in order to move forward with the purchase by that date. Oftentimes, people will write in there that the seller will have all work completed no later than, and they'll put in a specific date. So I never do any less than 3 days prior to closing. And the reason for that is because you want to make sure that you have the ability to make sure that that work is done. If the work hasn't been completed, you want the time to be able to renegotiate, like, okay, you didn't get the work done. How are we handling this now? Is the contractor going to be paid out of the closing? Are we going to have to do an escrow? Whatever the case may be, it gives you time to handle that. If there is some sort of reason that it wasn't, or if they just didn't get it completed. And then the right to cure is again, completely just if you're trying to serve a notice of defects. So the notice of defects would be if you aren't seeing any way that you're coming to an agreement, you serve an objection to the defects as listed in the inspection report. If they don't have the right to cure the offer, then you're done. It's null and void. You'd want to get a cancellation and mutual release signed as well, because that determines where the earnest money goes and officially cancels everything. But if you serve a notice of defects and they have the right to cure, that just means they have the ability to cure these items. And that's where we would want to use this language here, in the right to cure, because it more explicitly outlines that the work should be done in a much more specific manner than the vague language that's currently in the offer. Um, does anyone have any questions around any of that? Okay. So, as a reminder, if you want to do testing within the offer, you need to check that off. And it's a completely separate thing. It does not, um, it can't be covered in any tests recommended by the inspector if you're on the offer to purchase. So, I've mentioned this at a meeting, but I would always use a GMAR Addendum A with an offer, even if you don't really have anything specifically outlined in there that you need to use. There's a lot of safeguards within the GMAR Addendum A anyway, so just kind of make a habit of using it, even if you're not checking any of the boxes specifically. But here is where you would add testing contingencies in. So for instance, I had a client who was super duper worried about asbestos, and they really wanted to make sure that if something looked like asbestos in our inspection, that they did have the ability to test for it. So we checked this box and we put asbestos as a specific type of test that we would like to have done. Some people are really worried about mold. Maybe they have really bad allergies or asthmatic or whatever the case may be. That's where you want to make sure you're writing this in. Um, this is more something that's going to be relevant to the buyer and something that like is important to them. So make sure you're having those conversations with them. Oftentimes an inspector's not gonna they're not gonna call out mold. They can't call it mold because they haven't been able to test for it. The same thing with asbestos. They might say, there's a lot of times where we run into asbestos is in floor tiles in basements, or the wrap around pipes in basements. It kind of looks like a cast, and that's often what is asbestos. Um, and it's, an insulation that they used at the time, but it's obviously not good for our health. So they would call that out. They aren't necessarily going to say it's 100% asbestos or it is mold. They usually say organic growth or asbestos-like material. So if your buyer is okay with just kind of knowing that and just saying, having someone evaluate it and handling it appropriately is good enough for them, or if they want to officially test for it, that's up to them. But then you would want to make sure that if they want the right to do that, you check this box. This is again one of those boxes. If you're not in competition, it's not a bad idea just to include it. Just so if, you never know what you're going to run into with an inspection, um, that it's just kind of agreed to up front. So, any questions on that? Okay. So other best practices, for inspections are, again, kind of, my screen's not working. You want to be sure that you have inspectors that do a good job, are thorough, are going to take the time to go through each piece of the property. There are, they don't necessarily need to crawl on the roof. That's not a part of the requirement. But the ones that do often can find more than the person who, for instance, I had a man show up in a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops, and he just stood at the curb and looked at the roof and he said, "Looks good to me." And to me, that was very concerning. I had tons of anxiety around that. So just knowing who the client's coming with, and you are able to offer some suggestions. I just let them know they're not required to use them. But oftentimes they'll take that into consideration. Um, you want to make sure that they're looking at all of the things. And the other thing is the reports, I think it was as of 2021, do have to outline things that are defect items, safety items, further evaluation items. They're all kind of labeled and they should be really easy to read. It does make defining things that are defective items much easier. But then there are going to be some items that are labeled as needs further evaluation that could be considered a defect, but obviously would need further testing or evaluation to determine if that's in fact the case. But it does make it a lot clearer than it used to be. It used to be a really gray area. So that's been helpful as of, like I said, I think 2021 that has changed. But there are still some inspectors who have very vague reports. So again, it's just kind of, at least on your buyer side, knowing the people that you're able to send them to and that they're going to provide valuable feedback. Again, being there, especially if you're a newer, honestly, I still go to all my inspections. I've been doing this almost 20 years. I learn something new almost every time. It's just a really great time to hear about all different types of um, you know, how some of the different nuances of houses work. You run across something you've never seen before and they explain what it is so that the next time you see it, you're able to explain it. It's a really important thing, I think, to be there if you can, not only to learn for yourself, but then also to be able to go over the report and feel really confident about it with your client and know kind of what they heard at the inspection as well. Um, so that's the main stuff I have for you. If there's any questions or you wanted to bounce something off of me, or if you want to look at an inspection report, I can pull one up. Just kind of your time. So whatever you think or want to do here. Okay. Well, if everybody's good, then I can let you go. And thanks for coming.